When the Apache warrior Nayati found Eleanor Anderson bleeding in the desert with rope burns on her wrists and terror in her eyes, he made a promise that would echo across the territories. One more mark on her from the man who'd hurt her, and he'd dig a grave in the unforgiving earth of New Mexico. The sun hung like a burning coin in the New Mexico sky, casting shadows that stretched across the red earth like the fingers of ancient spirits. Eleanor Anderson stumbled through the scrub brush, her torn calico dress catching on thorns that seemed to reach for her with deliberate cruelty. Blood had dried on her split lip, and purple bruises bloomed across her collarbone where strong hands had gripped too tightly. The rope burns around her wrists told a story she wasn't ready to speak aloud. 3 days she'd been walking since she'd escaped from the ranch house near Santa Fe. 3 days with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination forged. In desperation, her husband's voice still echoed in her mind, promising to find her, promising to make her pay for the humiliation of running. But Eleanor had learned that some promises were worth breaking, especially when staying meant accepting. That bruises were the price of being a wife. The desert stretched endlessly before her, beautiful and merciless in equal measure. Sagebrush dotted the landscape like grey-green prayers, and somewhere in the distance, mountains rose like the backbone of sleeping giants. She'd heard stories of people who'd walked into this wilderness and never returned, claimed by heat or cold, or creatures that moved in the shadows between day and night. But she'd also heard other stories, whispered in the sewing circles of proper ladies who pretended. Such things didn't exist. Stories of women who'd disappeared into the frontier and found something better than the civilized cruelty of drawing rooms and marriage beds. Stories of Apache who helped the lost, who understood that sometimes the wilderness was kinder than the settlements that claimed to be tame. Eleanor didn't know if such stories were true, but she clung to them like a drowning woman clutches driftwood. The heat pressed down on her like a living thing, and her water had run out that morning. Each step felt like walking through honey, her legs trembling with exhaustion and dehydration. The torn hem of her dress trailed in the dust, picking up burrs and thorns that would have horrified her 3 days ago. Now she barely noticed them. Pain had become a constant companion, and she'd learned to measure it in degrees of bearable versus unbearable. A shadow passed overhead, and Eleanor looked up to see a hawk circling lazily in the thermals. For a moment, she envied the bird. Its freedom, its ability to see the world spread out below without the weight of fear crushing its chest. The hawk called once, a wild cry that seemed to echo off the distant cliffs, then soared away toward the mountains. Eleanor watched until it became a speck against the blue, then forced herself to keep walking. Nayati had been tracking the woman for 2 days, staying far enough back to avoid frightening her, but close enough to intervene if the desert claimed another victim. From his position among the red rocks above the canyon floor, he could see everything. The way she favored her left leg, suggesting an injury beneath the torn fabric of her dress. The careful way she moved her right arm, protecting ribs that were likely cracked or worse. Most telling of all, the way she constantly looked over her shoulder, not at the wilderness that might kill her, but back toward the settlements that had already tried. He'd seen her kind before, though not often, in this harsh country. Women who ran from husbands or fathers or brothers, who chose the uncertain mercy of the desert over the certain brutality of men who believed ownership came with wedding vows or blood ties. Some of them survived the crossing, finding new lives, in distant territories where questions weren't asked and past sins could be buried in unmarked graves. Others became bleached bones scattered across the canyon floors, their stories told only by the wind. This one had steel in her spine, though, something that reminded him of his own mother's people, the Apache women who could endure anything and still raise their children to be strong. She moved with purpose despite her injuries, and when she rested, she chose positions that offered good sightlines and multiple escape routes. Someone had taught her to think tactically, or the wilderness was teaching her quickly. Either way, it might be enough to keep her alive. Nayati shifted his position on the rocks, his moccasins silent on stone that would have betrayed a white man's boots with every step. His Apache father had taught him to move like water, to be everywhere and nowhere, to read the desert's moods like other men read newspapers. His Mexican mother had taught him to speak Spanish and English, to understand the complex web of hatred and fear that governed relations between the three peoples who claimed this land. Between them, they'd given him tools to survive in a world that didn't quite know what to make of a man who belonged fully to no single tribe. The woman below had stopped again, swaying on her feet as she tried to drink from a water skin that was clearly empty. Even from his perch 50 feet above, Nayati could see the tremor in her hands, the way she held herself too carefully. She was running on will alone now, and will could only carry someone so far in country that killed the strong and prepared. Soon she would fall, and then he would have to decide whether his desire for solitude outweighed his obligation to help those who couldn't help themselves. Eleanor felt her knees give out without warning, the red earth rushing up to meet her. With surprising gentleness, she lay where she fell, cheek pressed against sand that was still warm from the day's heat, and wondered if this was how it would end. Not with the crack of her husband's fist or the burn of his cigarettes against her skin, but with the simple, honest embrace of the desert that asked nothing of her except that she rest. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt an odd sense of peace. She'd made it 3 days on her own, farther than anyone back in Santa Fe would have thought possible for a woman raised in drawing rooms and finishing schools. Her mother would have been scandalized by the dirt under her fingernails, by the tears in her dress, and the wildness in her hair. But her mother had never had to choose between dignity and survival, had never felt the particular terror of being owned by a man who measured his love in bruises and broken promises. She closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her own breathing, shallow and quick in the thin air. Somewhere nearby, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and fierce at the same time. Eleanor had always thought coyotes were ugly, sneaking creatures, but now she understood them better. They survived by being cleverer than their enemies, by knowing when to fight and when to run, by adapting to a world that saw them as vermin despite their intelligence and loyalty to their own kind. The sound of approaching hoofbeats should have sent her scrambling for cover, should have triggered the panic that lived just beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. Instead, she felt only a weary resignation. Let them come, whoever they were. She'd run as far as her body could carry her, and if that wasn't far enough, at least she'd died trying to be free. The hoofbeats stopped nearby, and Eleanor heard the soft sound of someone dismounting. Boots approached across the sand, but these weren't the heavy tread of cavalry boots or the distinctive heel strike of her husband's riding boots. These footsteps were careful, deliberate, placed with the kind of precision that suggested someone accustomed to moving quietly through dangerous country. "Easy, woman." The voice was deep and calm, carrying an accent she couldn't immediately place. "I'm not here to hurt you." Eleanor opened her eyes and found herself looking at a pair of moccasins, beautifully crafted with intricate beadwork that caught the late afternoon light. Above them, leather leggings gave way to a simple cotton shirt and a vest decorated with silver conchos. She let her gaze travel upward slowly, taking in broad shoulders, a strong jaw, and eyes the color of dark amber. Apache, she realized, with a start that was part fear and part something else she couldn't name. Nayati crouched beside the fallen woman, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid startling her further. Up close, he could see the full extent of her injuries, and what he saw made something cold and hard settle in his chest. The bruises on her throat were shaped like fingerprints. The split in her lower lip was clean, the kind made by a ring striking tender flesh. Most damning of all were the rope burns on her wrists, too precise to be accidental, too fresh to be old wounds. "My name is Nayati," he said quietly, switching to English when he saw her tense at his appearance. "I've been watching your trail. For 2 days. You're hurt and dehydrated, and the night's going to be cold. Will you let me help you?" He kept his voice gentle, the tone he might use with a spooked horse or an injured animal. Experience had taught him that pain made all creatures wary, and this woman had clearly been hurt by men who should have protected her. Eleanor stared up at him, trying to process what she was seeing. She'd heard countless stories about Apache warriors, tales of savagery and violence that had filled the newspapers back east and provided entertainment for ladies who'd never seen the frontier. But the man crouched beside her didn't match those stories. His face was kind, intelligent, marked by lines that suggested laughter as much as hardship. His hands, resting easily on his knees, were gentle despite their obvious strength. "You're Apache," she whispered, not sure if it was a question or an observation. Something flickered in his dark eyes, an emotion she couldn't read but recognized, instinctively as pain. Of course, she realized with the start of shame. He'd probably heard that tone before, that mixture of fear and fascination that white people used when confronted with something they'd been taught to hate but didn't understand. "Half Apache," Nayati corrected gently. "My mother was Mexican, from a village near the Rio Grande. She taught me that kindness doesn't depend on the color of a person's skin or the language they speak." He gestured toward her injuries with careful neutrality. "Someone hurt you recently. You ran, and you've been walking for days without proper supplies or rest. In another few hours, the cold will finish what the heat started. So I'll ask again, will you let me help you?" Eleanor tried to sit up, and immediately regretted it as the world spun around her like a child's top. Nayati's hand shot out to steady her, his touch gentle but firm. She should have pulled away, should have been terrified of this strange man who'd appeared out of nowhere, in the middle of the desert. Instead, she found herself leaning into his strength, accepting help for the first time in months without calculating the cost. "I don't have anything to pay you with," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. It was what her husband had, always demanded payment for every kindness, every moment of peace. "I don't have money or jewelry or anything of value. I can work, though. I'm strong, and I learn quickly, and I won't be any trouble." Payment. Nayati's voice carried a note of confusion that made Eleanor look at him more closely. "You're hurt and alone in country that kills the strong and prepared. Why would I ask for payment to help you?" He settled back on his heels, studying her, with those remarkable amber eyes. "My people have a saying, we are only as strong as those we help to stand. You need help standing. That's reason enough." Nayati lifted Eleanor as easily as he might lift a child, his arms supporting her, weight without apparent effort. She tensed instinctively, memories of other times men had picked her up, but his touch remained gentle, impersonal. He carried her to where his horse waited, a magnificent paint stallion that watched their approach with intelligent eyes and pricked ears. The horse was unlike any Eleanor had ever seen, built for endurance rather than show, with the kind of deep chest and strong hindquarters that suggested it could carry a rider across hundreds of miles of rough country without faltering. Silver and turquoise decorated its bridle, and painted symbols on its flanks told stories she couldn't read but somehow understood, spoke of protection and safe journeys. "His name is Tsehutsui," Nayati said, pronouncing the Apache word with casual ease. "It means flows like water. He's carried me safely for 6 years, through country that would kill most horses. He'll carry us both now." He helped Eleanor onto the horse's back, supporting her weight until she could settle. herself in front of the saddle. The paint stood perfectly still throughout the process, as if he understood the delicate nature of his cargo. Nayati swung up behind her with fluid grace, his body warm against her back as he gathered the reins. Eleanor had ridden before, but always side saddle in carefully controlled circumstances with grooms hovering nearby. This was different, raw and immediate, the horse's power obvious beneath them as Nayati guided them away from the spot where she'd collapsed. The rhythm of the horse's gait was soothing, and despite herself, Eleanor felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Where are we going?" she asked, as they crested a small rise and the desert opened up before them in shades of gold and red. The sun was setting now, painting the western sky in colors that seemed too beautiful to be real. She'd never seen a sunset like this from the confines of her husband's ranch, had never realized how vast the world could look when viewed without the bars of windows and the weight of fear. "To my camp," Nayati replied, his voice close to her ear, but not uncomfortably so. "It's hidden in a canyon about an hour's ride from here. There's water and shelter, and I have supplies to treat your injuries properly. You'll be safe there while you decide what comes next." The casual way he said it, as if her safety were a given, rather than something to be negotiated or purchased, made something tight in Eleanor's chest begin to loosen. The entrance to Nayati's canyon was so well concealed that Eleanor would have ridden past it without noticing if she'd been alone. A narrow gap between two towering rock formations, barely wide enough for a horse and rider, opened onto a hidden valley that seemed like something from a dream. Springs bubbled up from underground sources, feeding a small stream that supported the cottonwoods and willows. Grass grew thick near the water, providing forage for several horses that looked up curiously at their approach. "How did you find this place?" Eleanor breathed, marveling at the hidden paradise tucked away in the harsh desert. The canyon walls rose on all sides, creating a natural fortress that would be nearly impossible to find without knowing exactly where to look. Ancient pictographs decorated the rock faces, telling stories in symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering firelight from a campfire that burned in a carefully constructed fire ring. "My grandfather showed it to me when I was 12, Nayati explained as he helped her down from the horse. His grandfather showed it to him, and his grandfather before that. For generations, my mother's people used this place as a refuge during the worst times. When the Mexican army swept through the territory, when the Apache wars grew too bloody for anyone to remember why they'd started, when families needed a place to heal that was far from the hatred of both sides." He gestured toward the pictographs, with obvious reverence. "Those tell the stories of all who've sheltered here. Perhaps someday your story will join theirs." Eleanor stared at the ancient artwork, overwhelmed by the idea that she was standing in a place that had offered sanctuary to countless others who'd fled from violence and pain. The figures on the walls seemed to move in the shifting firelight, and she could almost imagine them stepping down from the stone to welcome her into their company of survivors. Nayati's camp was simple but comfortable, consisting of a traditional Apache wickiup, supplemented by a few trade goods that suggested contact with Mexican and American settlements. Blankets and buffalo hides provided bedding, while carefully woven baskets held supplies and foodstuffs. A rack of weapons stood near the fire, but they were arranged more like tools than threats, speaking of a man who was prepared for violence but didn't seek it out. "Sit," Nayati commanded gently, guiding Eleanor to a comfortable spot near the fire. The warmth felt wonderful against her skin, and she realized she'd been cold for days without acknowledging it. He disappeared into the wickiup and returned with a bundle of supplies, including clean cloths, a clay pot of what looked like medicinal salve, and a gourd filled with clear, cool water. "Drink slowly," he advised, as Eleanor reached eagerly for the water. "Too much too fast will make you sick." His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he began to clean her wounds, his touch professional but gentle. "I learned healing from my grandmother," he explained, when Eleanor tensed at his proximity. She was a medicine woman, respected by both sides during the worst of the fighting. She taught me that healing requires trust, both giving it and receiving it. Eleanor found herself studying his face as he worked, noting the concentration in his expression, the careful way he handled her injuries. When was the last time someone had touched her with such gentleness? When was the last time masculine strength had been used to help rather than harm? She couldn't remember, and the realization brought tears to her eyes that had nothing to do with physical pain. As full darkness settled over the canyon, Nayati prepared a simple meal of roasted meat and wild vegetables gathered from the hidden valley. The food was unlike anything Eleanor had eaten before, seasoned with herbs and spices that carried flavors both familiar and exotic. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, while her host maintained a comfortable silence. "Thank you," she said finally, the words inadequate for what she was feeling. "I don't know why you helped me, but thank you." She looked across the fire at him, this man who'd appeared out of nowhere to save her life without asking for anything in return. In the firelight, his features seemed carved from the same stone. As the canyon walls, strong and enduring and somehow timeless, Nayati stirring the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky. "My grandmother used to say that we're all walking the same path, just at different points along the way. Some of us have walked farther, learned more about avoiding the obstacles and finding the safe places to rest. When we meet someone who's still learning to walk, we help them find their footing. It's not kindness exactly. It's just what people do when they remember they're part of something larger than themselves." Eleanor pulled the blanket he'd given her more tightly around her shoulders, drawing comfort from its warmth and the steady crackle of the fire. "What happened to your family, your grandmother and the others?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry, that's too personal." "War happened," Nayati said simply, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. "The kind of war where there are no clear sides, just people trying to protect what they love from other people trying to do the same thing. My grandmother survived the Mexican period and the early American conflicts, but she couldn't survive the hatred that grew between her grandchildren and mine. She died trying to make peace between two groups of people who'd forgotten how to see each other as human." The silence that followed was heavy, with shared understanding of loss. Eleanor thought of her own family, scattered by death and distance, and the kind of slow violence that happened in drawing rooms and marriage beds. "I'm sorry," she said again, meaning it this time. "What about you?" Nayati asked gently. "What brought you to the desert alone, hurt and running from something that put fear in your eyes?" He didn't push, didn't demand answers, just offered the opportunity to share if she chose to. It was such a foreign concept, being given a choice about what to reveal, that Eleanor almost didn't know how to respond. She found herself talking anyway, the words spilling out in the safety of firelight and genuine attention. She told him about her marriage to Thomas Anderson, a wealthy rancher who'd seemed charming and sophisticated during their brief courtship, about how quickly that charm had curdled into possession, how his love had revealed itself as something that required her complete submission and absolute silence, about the gradual escalation from sharp words to shoves to the kind of violence that left marks hidden beneath long sleeves and high collars. "He said it was my fault," Eleanor heard herself say, the words bitter on her tongue. "Said I was too willful, too independent, too much like the suffragettes in the newspapers. Said if I'd just learned to be a proper wife, he wouldn't have to correct me so often." She touched the rope burns on her wrists unconsciously. 3 days, Ego, he tied me to a chair and told me he was going to break me properly this time, the way you'd break a horse. That's when I knew if I didn't run, I'd die there. Nayati's jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice remained calm and controlled. You did the right thing. Surviving takes courage, and choosing freedom over safety takes even more. Not everyone is strong enough to make that choice. The words carried conviction that made Eleanor straighten slightly, seeing herself through his eyes for the first time, not as a failure or a victim, but as someone who'd fought for her own life and won. As the fire burned lower and the desert night deepened around them, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Safety. Not the brittle, temporary safety that came from hiding or appeasing, but the deep, bone-level safety that came from being seen and accepted without conditions. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own fears and decisions. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she could rest without listening for approaching footsteps or calculating escape routes. Sleep, Nayati said softly, banking the fire for the night. You're safe here. Nothing can find this place that I don't want to find it, and I promise you that your husband is not welcome in this canyon. And for the first time since her wedding day, Eleanor Anderson closed her eyes and slept without fear. Eleanor woke to the sound of water trickling over stones and birds, singing in languages she'd never heard before. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, her mind still trapped in the familiar terror of waking in her husband's house, waiting for his footsteps in the hall. Then she opened her eyes and saw the canyon walls rising around her like protective arms painted gold and crimson by the early morning sun, and remembered that she was free. Nayati was already up, tending a small cook fire and preparing what looked like some kind of grain porridge in a blackened pot. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to solitude, every action purposeful and unhurried. When he noticed she was awake, he offered a slight nod but didn't speak, respecting her need to orient herself to this new reality. How long did I sleep? Eleanor asked, sitting up carefully and testing her body's response. The aches were still there, but muted now, manageable. Her throat felt raw from days without adequate water, but the terrible bone-deep exhaustion that had driven her to collapse was gone. She felt human again, rather than a creature driven purely by survival instinct. Nearly 12 hours, Nayati replied, ladling the porridge into wooden bowls. Your body needed to recover from what you put it through. 3 days in the desert without proper supplies would have killed most people. He handed her a bowl and a carved spoon, the wood smooth and warm from countless meals. This is made from ground acorns and wild seeds. It's not fancy, but it will give you strength. Eleanor tasted the porridge tentatively and found it surprisingly flavorful, with a nutty richness that satisfied her empty stomach. As she ate, she studied her surroundings in daylight, marveling at details she'd missed the night before. The canyon was larger than she'd realized, with several smaller branches leading off in different directions. A natural shelf of rock formed a kind of outdoor kitchen area, while another alcove had been arranged as a workshop where tools and weapons hung in careful order. "You've been living here alone?" she asked, gesturing at the well-organized camp. Everything had its place, from the carefully stacked firewood to the herbs drying on wooden frames. It spoke of someone who'd made peace with solitude but hadn't let it make him careless or lazy. "For about 3 years now," Nayati confirmed, settling cross-legged on a woven mat with his own bowl. "After the last of the Apache wars ended, there wasn't much place for someone like me in either world. Too Apache for the Mexican settlements, too Mexican for the Apache bands that survived, too willing to help both sides for anyone to trust me completely. So I came here, where the only judgment comes from the land itself." Eleanor heard something in his voice that she recognized, the particular loneliness that came not from being alone, but from being misunderstood. Don't you miss having people around, conversation and companionship?" She paused, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous. You barely know me. I miss some things," Nayati admitted, surprising her with his honesty. "I miss my grandmother's stories, the way she could make the old legends come alive around the fire. I miss the sound of children laughing, the way they see magic in ordinary things. But I don't miss the constant vigilance that comes from living among people who might turn on you if the political winds shift." He studied her face carefully. "What about you? What do you miss from before?" The question caught Eleanor off guard, forcing her to think beyond the immediate relief of escape. What had she lost besides the bruises and the fear? What had Thomas taken from her beyond her safety and peace of mind? The answer, when it came, surprised her with its clarity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "I miss teaching," she said slowly, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "Before I married Thomas, I taught school in a little town outside Denver, 8 years old to 16, all in one room, and I loved every minute of it. The way their faces would light up when they finally understood a difficult concept, or when they discovered a book that captured their imagination. Thomas said it wasn't appropriate for a rancher's wife to work, that it reflected poorly on his ability to provide." She set down her bowl, appetite suddenly gone as memories washed over her. "I had to give up everything that made me who I was. My books, my teaching materials, even my correspondence with former students. Thomas said a wife should find all her satisfaction in making her husband happy, that outside interests were a sign of discontent that needed to be corrected." The last words came out bitter and sharp, tainted by months of having her own thoughts and feelings dismissed as character flaws. Nayati was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression she couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he understood more about loss than she'd realized. "My grandmother was a storyteller before she became a medicine woman. She knew hundreds of old tales, songs that had been passed down for generations. But during the worst years of fighting, when simply being Apache was dangerous enough, she stopped telling the stories. Said it wasn't safe to preserve the old ways when the new ones demanded complete submission." He looked up at Eleanor then, and she saw her own grief reflected in his dark eyes. She died believing she'd failed her people by letting the stories die with her. But stories aren't really lost, as long as someone remembers their importance. Neither are teachers or the love that teaching represents. Thomas may have silenced your voice, but he couldn't change what lives in your heart. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unexpected gift of being seen and understood. When was the last time someone had spoken to her about who she was rather than who she was supposed to be? When was the last time her thoughts and feelings had been treated as valuable rather than inconvenient? That afternoon, Nayati began teaching Eleanor the skills she would need to survive in this harsh but beautiful country. Not because he expected her to stay, but because knowledge was power, and she'd been powerless for too long. He showed her how to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, how to read the subtle signs that indicated water or weather changes, how to move quietly across terrain that seemed designed to announce every footstep. "The desert isn't trying to kill you," he explained as they gathered wild onions near the canyon stream. "It's simply indifferent to whether you live or die. The secret is learning to work with it instead of against it, to take what it offers and ask for nothing more." He demonstrated how to dig up the bulbs without damaging the root system, ensuring the plants would continue to grow and provide food for future seasons. Eleanor found herself fascinated by the complexity of knowledge required to thrive in this environment. Every plant, every rock formation, every shift in the wind carried information that could mean the difference between life and death. It was like learning a new language, one written in earth and sky instead of books and blackboards. In the old days, Apache children learned these lessons from the time they could walk, Nayati continued, showing her how to weave grass into a watertight basket. Not because we expected them to live alone in the wilderness, but because understanding the land made them strong and self-sufficient. A person who knows they can survive anything has a different kind of confidence than someone who depends entirely on others. The words struck Eleanor with unexpected force. How long had it been since she'd felt truly self-sufficient? Even before her marriage, she'd been dependent on her father's support, then her husband's provision. The idea of being able to take care of herself completely, to need no one's permission or protection, was both terrifying and exhilarating. As the days passed, Eleanor threw herself into learning with the enthusiasm she'd once brought to her teaching. Nayati proved to be an excellent instructor, patient and thorough, breaking complex skills down into manageable steps. He taught her to shoot his rifle and revolver, to start fires with flint and steel, to read tracks and weather signs. More importantly, he taught her to trust her own instincts, to stop second-guessing every decision. "Your husband was wrong about many things," Nayati said one afternoon as he showed Eleanor how to prepare medicinal poultices from desert plants. "But he was especially wrong about your teaching. Good teachers see the potential in others and help them discover it in themselves. You're doing that now, every day, as you learn to see your own strength." Eleanor's hands stilled on the grinding stone she'd been using to crush herbs. "How can you be so certain? You barely know me." The protest came automatically, the product of years of having her self-worth systematically destroyed by a man who claimed to love her. "I know you ran when staying would have been easier and safer. I know you survived 3 days in country that kills experienced travelers. I know you're learning skills in days that take most people months to master. Most importantly, I know you haven't asked me once when you can leave here, which tells me you're thinking about staying, not because you're afraid to go, but because you're starting to remember who you used to be." The observation hit Eleanor like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. She had been thinking about staying, not permanently perhaps, but long enough to become truly self-sufficient. The idea of returning to civilization, of trying to build a new life while constantly looking over her shoulder for Thomas, held no appeal compared to the peace she'd found in this hidden canyon. "What if Thomas finds me here?" she asked, voicing the fear that woke her in the deepest part of the night. "What if he brings men with him, or the law? You could be hurt because you helped me." The thought of bringing violence to this peaceful place, of repaying Nayati's kindness with danger, made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Nayati set down the clay pot he'd been mixing herbs in and looked at her directly. "Eleanor, I've lived through 3 separate wars in this territory. I've seen cavalry charges and Apache raids, Mexican bandits and American fortune hunters. I've survived by being smarter and more careful than my enemies, and by choosing my battles wisely. Your husband may be dangerous to a woman alone in a house she can't escape, but he's just another cruel man in a land full of them. He doesn't frighten me." There was something in his voice, a quiet certainty that went beyond mere bravado, that made Eleanor believe him. For the first time since her escape, she allowed herself to think about the future, not as something to be endured, but as something to be planned for. Eleanor's healing wasn't just physical, though her bruises were fading and her rope burns had become thin white lines. The deeper wounds, the ones carved into her soul by months of systematic cruelty, proved more stubborn. She still jerked awake at unexpected sounds, still flinched when Nayati moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. Worst of all were the nightmares that left her gasping and shaking in the pre-dawn darkness. The first time it happened, Nayati simply appeared beside her bedroll without explanation, settling close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to feel threatening. He didn't ask what she dreamed about or try to offer empty reassurances. Instead, he talked quietly about the night sounds around them, identifying each bird call and explaining what the different sounds meant, grounding her in the reality of the present moment. "The screech owl is hunting," he said softly, as a harsh cry echoed off the canyon walls. "It's not a sound most people find pleasant, but it means the night is proceeding as it should. The owl takes mice and rats that would otherwise eat our stored grain. Even the sounds that frighten us often serve a purpose we don't immediately understand." Eleanor found his voice soothing, the calm certainty of someone completely at home in his environment. Gradually, her breathing slowed and her heartbeat returned to normal. When she finally lay back down, he remained sitting nearby, a solid presence between her and whatever demons her sleeping mind conjured. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked into the darkness, genuinely puzzled by his patience and care. "You don't know anything about me, about whether I deserve help or not. What if I'm not who you think I am?" "I know you're someone who was hurt by people who should have protected you," Nayati replied quietly. "I know you're brave enough to choose freedom over safety, intelligent enough to learn quickly, and strong enough to survive in country that would kill most people. What else do I need to know?" He paused, considering his words carefully. "My grandmother used to say that we judge people not by where they come from, but by where they choose to go. You chose to go toward freedom, even when it meant walking into the desert alone. That tells me everything important about who you are." As Eleanor grew stronger and more confident, she began finding ways to contribute to their shared life in the canyon. Her education, so dismissed and devalued by Thomas, proved invaluable in unexpected ways. She organized Nayati's medical supplies using systems she'd learned from managing school inventories, making it easier for him to find what he needed quickly. Her knowledge of reading and writing allowed her to help him document his grandmother's medicinal recipes, preserving knowledge that had previously existed only in memory. "You're making a book of medicine," Nayati observed one afternoon watching Eleanor carefully write out detailed instructions for preparing various herbal remedies. Her handwriting was clear and precise, each letter formed with the particular care of someone who'd spent years writing on blackboards for children to copy. "I'm making several books," Eleanor corrected, showing him the neat stacks of pages she'd prepared. "One for internal medicines, one for treating wounds and injuries, one for plants that can be used for food in emergency situations. Your grandmother's knowledge is too valuable to risk losing." She looked up at him with something approaching her old teaching enthusiasm. "Would you like to learn to read and write yourself? I could teach you." The offer clearly surprised him, and Eleanor saw something flicker across his face that might have been longing quickly suppressed. "Most white people assume Apache can't learn such things," he said carefully, "or that we have no use for books and writing." "Most white people are fools," Eleanor replied tartly, surprising them both with her vehemence. "Intelligence has nothing to do with the color of someone's skin or the language they were born speaking. You've already shown me you have one of the finest minds I've ever encountered. Teaching you to read would be a privilege, not a favor." And so, in the evenings after their work was done, Eleanor began teaching Nayati to read and write in both English and Spanish. He proved to be an exceptionally quick student, approaching the written word with the same careful attention he brought to tracking and healing. Within weeks, he was reading simple passages from Eleanor's few books, his finger tracing each word as he sounded out unfamiliar combinations of letters. It was during one of these quiet evening lessons that Eleanor finally asked the question that had been haunting her for weeks. Nayati was reading aloud from a collection of poetry she'd managed to save from her former life. his voice giving new music to familiar words. "Why haven't you tried to find a wife and start a family?" The question slipped out before she could. "Stop it," prompted by watching him handle a book with the same gentle care he brought to wounded animals and frightened women. "You're obviously intelligent and capable, and you'd make a good father. Don't you want children of your own?" Nayati set the book aside carefully, his expression unreadable in the firelight. For a moment, Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer, that she'd overstepped some invisible boundary with her curiosity. Then he sighed, a sound that carried years of disappointment and resignation. "I did try once," he admitted quietly. "There was a woman in my mother's village, Maria Esperanza, beautiful and kind, with a laugh that could make even the old men smile. We were going to be married, start a family, maybe open a trading post that served both Apache and Mexican customers." His voice trailed off, and Eleanor saw his hands clench involuntarily. "What happened?" she asked gently, recognizing the particular pain that came from losing not just a person, but a future you'd imagined sharing with them. "Her family decided I was too Apache for their Mexican daughter, while my father's people thought she was too Mexican for their Apache son. The army was recruiting Apache scouts at the time, offering good money for men willing to track other Apache bands. Maria's father said if I wanted to marry his daughter, I needed to prove my loyalty to Mexico by taking the army's offer." Nayati's jaw tightened with old anger. "I refused. I wouldn't hunt my own people for money, no matter how much I loved her. Maria's father forbade the marriage, and she was too young and scared to defy him." Eleanor felt her heart break a little for this man who'd been caught between worlds through no fault of his own, punished for the accident of his birth, and the complexity of his loyalties. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Love shouldn't have to pass political tests. After that, I stopped trying to find a place in either world," Nayati continued. "It seemed easier to be alone than to keep hoping people would see past their prejudices long enough to know who I really was. But loneliness is a cold companion, especially when the nights are long and the silence stretches on without end." The confession hung between them like something fragile and precious, an acknowledgement of vulnerability that Eleanor understood better than most. She thought about her own isolation, the way Thomas had systematically cut her off from friends and family, until she'd had no one to turn to when his true nature revealed itself. "I understand loneliness," she said finally, "the kind that comes from being surrounded by people who don't really see you, who only value you for what you can provide them. Sometimes being alone is honest, at least. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not." She looked across the fire at him. This man who'd saved her life and asked for nothing in return, who'd shown her kindness without conditions or expectations. "But maybe," she added quietly, "maybe we don't have to be alone anymore." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither was quite ready to examine, but something had shifted in the space around the fire, something that felt like possibility taking root in soil that had long lain fallow. Eleanor went to sleep that night, thinking not about the past that had driven her to this canyon, but about a future that might include laughter and companionship, and the kind of love that didn't demand surrender in exchange for safety. Jebediah. Cross had been tracking runaway wives for 15 years, and he prided himself on never losing a trail. The tall, scarred man sat his horse at the edge of Santa Fe, studying the reward poster that Thomas Anderson had pressed into his calloused hands 3 weeks ago. $500 for the safe return of one Eleanor Anderson, described as mentally unstable and prone to fits of hysteria that made her dangerous to herself and others. Cross had heard that particular lie enough times to recognize it immediately. Men like Anderson didn't put up $500 for mentally unstable wives. They put up that kind of money for wives who'd found enough courage to run and might find enough sense not to come back. But Cross didn't care about the truth behind his contracts. He cared about the money, and Anderson's gold was as good as anyone else's. The trail had gone cold at the edge of the desert, where most sensible people would have turned back or died trying to cross the wasteland on foot. But Cross wasn't most people, and his Apache tracker, a broken-down old man named Joseph who drank too much and talked too little, had found sign where others saw only empty sand and stone. "Woman went into the big desert," Joseph had mumbled, through his perpetual alcoholic haze. Alone, hurt, walking like someone who don't know the country. Should be bones by now, but maybe coyotes scattered them too far to find. He'd paused to take another drink from his ever-present bottle. Course, there's stories about that country. Old stories about spirits that help lost souls, about hidden places where people go to disappear. Cross had backhanded the old Apache for talking nonsense, but privately he wondered. He'd heard those stories too, whispered around campfires by men who'd ridden the territory longer than memory served. Tales of a half-breed who lived like a ghost in the deepest desert, who sometimes helped people who needed to vanish from their old lives. Most dismissed such stories as superstition, but Cross had learned to pay attention to legends that persisted across cultures and generations. Now, 3 weeks into the hunt, Cross was beginning to think the old drunk might have been right. The woman's trail had led deeper into the wasteland than any sane person would go, following routes that suggested either desperation or guidance from someone who knew the country intimately. And twice now, Cross had found evidence of recent camps with multiple sets of tracks, one belonging to unshod horses in the Apache style. Nayati felt the wrongness before he saw anything concrete, the way a deer senses wolves long before they come into view. He'd been checking his snares in the outer canyons when the feeling hit him, a prickle between his shoulder blades that spoke of hostile eyes and dangerous intent. Years of living between worlds had taught him to trust such instincts, even when his rational mind found no obvious cause for alarm. He abandoned the snares immediately and made his way to the highest observation point in the canyon system, a narrow ledge that offered a commanding view of the approaches from 3 directions. What he saw there made his blood run cold. 2 men on horseback, moving with the systematic patience of professional trackers, following a route that would bring them uncomfortably close to the hidden canyon's entrance. The white man was obviously the leader, tall and lean with the kind of scars that spoke of violence, survived rather than accidents endured. He rode a good horse and carried quality weapons, suggesting success in whatever bloody trade he followed. But it was his companion that made Nayati's jaw clench with recognition and disgust. Joseph Crowfeather, once a respected scout and warrior, now reduced to guiding white bounty hunters to Apache hiding places in exchange for whiskey money. Nayati had known Joseph in better days, before the wars had broken something essential in the older man's spirit. They'd fought side by side during the worst years, when survival had required choosing between impossible loyalties. Joseph had chosen whiskey instead, drowning his shame in a bottle while selling out his own people one contract at a time. Seeing him here, leading strangers toward the sanctuary that had sheltered so many refugees, felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than any blade. The bounty hunter was good at his work, Nayati had to admit. He read sign like a scholar read books, interpreting every broken twig and displaced stone with the kind of attention that missed nothing important. Worse, he was patient, moving slowly and methodically rather than rushing ahead in blind pursuit. Such men were dangerous, precisely because they couldn't be hurried into mistakes. Nayati slipped away from his observation post and made his way back to the canyon as quickly as stealth would allow. Elena needed to know that her past had finally caught up with them, and they needed to prepare for the kind of confrontation that would test everything they'd built together over the past month. Eleanor was tending the cook fire when Nayati returned, humming softly to herself as she stirred a pot of stew that smelled like home and safety. The sight of her there, so completely at peace in the hidden canyon that had become their shared refuge, made what he had to tell her even harder. She looked up at his approach with a smile that died when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, setting aside her wooden spoon and rising to face whatever new crisis had entered their small paradise. The transformation was instant and heartbreaking. The relaxed woman of moments before disappeared, replaced by someone braced for the next blow from a world that had taught her to expect nothing but pain. "There are men tracking you," Nayati said without preamble, knowing that gentle approaches would only prolong her anxiety. "A bounty hunter and his Apache guide may be half a day behind your original trail. They're good at what they do, and they're not giving up." He watched the color drain from her face, saw her hands begin to tremble despite her obvious efforts. "At control, Thomas," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a curse. "He hired someone to bring me back." The terrible certainty in her voice told Nayati that she'd always known this moment would come, had been living with the knowledge that her husband's reach was longer than the distance she'd managed to put between them. "Tell me about him," Nayati demanded gently but firmly. "Not your husband, the man he would hire for this kind of work. What kind of resources does he have? What kind of connections?" Strategic thinking had kept him alive through 3 wars, and it would serve them now if Eleanor could provide the intelligence he needed. Eleanor sank onto a nearby rock, her legs suddenly unsteady. "Thomas has money, lots of it from his ranch, and his investments back east. He has political connections too, friends in the territorial government who owe him favors. But more than that, he has rage." She looked up at Nayati with eyes that held too much knowledge of masculine violence. "He can't stand the idea that I defied him, that I chose freedom over his version of love. He'll spend everything he has to drag me back, not because he misses me, but because letting me go would mean admitting he was wrong." The analysis was clear-headed despite her obvious fear, and Nayati found himself once again impressed by the intelligence that Thomas Anderson had tried so hard to suppress. Eleanor understood her enemy better than most people understood their friends, which was knowledge they could use. "The bounty hunter will try to take you alive," Nayati observed, thinking through the tactical implications. "Dead, you're worthless to him, and your husband wants the satisfaction of punishing you himself. That gives us advantages if we're smart about using them." He began pacing, his mind working through possibilities and contingencies with the speed of long practice. "Us." Eleanor's voice was small but steady. "Nayati, you don't have to fight my battles for me. You've already done more than anyone could expect, more than I had any right to ask for. If you help me escape again, find another route out of the territory, I can disappear somewhere he'll never think to look." The suggestion hit Nayati like a physical blow, not because it was unreasonable, but because it revealed how little she understood what she'd come to mean to him. The idea of her leaving, of returning to a life of constant flight and fear, was unacceptable for reasons that had nothing to do with chivalry or obligation. "No," Nayati said firmly, his voice carrying a finality that made Eleanor look at him with surprise. "You're not running anymore. This is your home now if you want it to be, and no one takes what's mine without a fight." The possessive pronoun slipped out before he could stop it, revealing more about his feelings than he'd intended to share. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for signs of the kind of ownership that had defined her marriage. Instead, she saw something entirely different, a protectiveness that came from caring rather than controlling, from wanting to shield rather than possess. "Yours?" she asked quietly, testing the word and its implications. In Thomas's mouth, such language had been a chain and a threat, a reminder that she was property to be used as he saw fit. From Nayati, it sounded like a promise of safety, an offer of belonging that came without conditions or demands. "Mine to protect if you'll have it," Nayati clarified, his voice gentler now, but no less determined. "Mine to stand beside when trouble comes calling. Mine to share this canyon with for as long as you want to stay." He moved closer, not crowding her, but close enough that she could see the sincerity in his dark eyes. "And if I choose to leave?" Eleanor asked, needing to know that her freedom was real, that this offer came without the hidden costs that had defined every other relationship in her life. "Then I'll help you go safely and wish you well wherever the trail takes you," Nayati replied without hesitation. "But I won't let you be driven away by fear, not when we have the power to make a stand here." He gestured toward the canyon walls that rose around them like natural fortifications. "This place has sheltered my people for generations. It can shelter us now." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of bonds she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what freedom felt like. Here was a man offering to fight for her, not because he owned her, but because he chose to value her. The distinction was profound enough to change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. They spent the afternoon preparing for siege, drawing on Nayati's military experience and Eleanor's surprising tactical insights. The hidden canyon was naturally defensible, with only one primary entrance that could be easily blocked and observed. Fresh water came from underground springs that couldn't be poisoned or diverted, while food stores and ammunition were sufficient. For an extended standoff, they'll try to scout the entrance first, Nayati explained, as he checked his weapons with practiced efficiency. Professional bounty hunters don't rush into unknown territory without intelligence. That gives us time to prepare surprises for them. He showed Eleanor how to load and aim his spare rifle, noting with approval how quickly she mastered the unfamiliar weapon. "What about Joseph?" Eleanor asked, having listened carefully to Nayati's description of the Apache tracker. "Will he know about this place? About the canyon's defenses?" The question showed she was thinking strategically rather than just reacting to immediate threats. "Joseph is drunk most of the time now, and his memory isn't what it used to be," Nayati admitted grimly. "But he was a good scout once before. The whiskey took him. He might remember stories about the hidden canyons, even if he doesn't know their exact locations." He paused in his preparations, struck by a sudden possibility. "Actually, that might work in our favor." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, recognizing the tone of someone working through a complex plan. "How so?" "Joseph's weakness is also his strength from our perspective," Nayati explained. "He needs whiskey, more than he needs money, and he's not particularly loyal to whoever's paying him this week. If we can separate him from the bounty hunter, get him alone long enough for a conversation, we might be able to turn him." The plan was risky, but it offered possibilities that straight confrontation didn't. "You want to try to buy his loyalty?" Eleanor asked, clearly skeptical about the reliability of such arrangements. "I want to remind him who he used to be before the bottle made him forget," Nayati corrected. "Joseph was a good man once, a warrior who protected the helpless and honored the old ways. Somewhere under all that whiskey and shame, that man might still exist." He looked at Eleanor seriously. "But if that fails, if he chooses money over honor, then we handle this the hard way." Cross and Joseph made camp that evening at a waterhole 3 miles from the canyon entrance, close enough to continue tracking at first light, but far enough away to avoid immediate detection. Cross had noticed the increasing sophistication of the trail they were following, the way it seemed to anticipate pursuit and take defensive precautions. Someone was helping the woman now, someone who knew the country and understood the art of evasion. "Tell me about the stories," Cross demanded, as Joseph built a small, smokeless fire with the kind of expertise that survived even chronic alcoholism. The ones about spirits helping lost souls in this country. He'd been thinking about those half-remembered tales all day, wondering if they might explain the peculiarities of the trail he was following. Joseph's hands stilled on the kindling, and for a moment his rheumy eyes showed something like the intelligence that had once made him a respected scout. "Old stories," he mumbled, reaching automatically for his bottle. From before the wars, when the people still remembered the proper. "What people? What proper ways?" Cross's voice carried the kind of quiet menace that had convinced stronger men than Joseph to talk freely. Joseph took a long pull from his bottle before answering, the whiskey loosening his tongue in the way Cross had learned to exploit. "There was a place," he said slowly, his words slightly slurred but still comprehensible. "Hidden canyon system used by the old medicine men for ceremonies and healing. Later, during the worst fighting, families would go there to hide from the cavalry and the Mexican troops." Cross leaned forward, sensing information that might finally explain the complexities of this particular hunt. "Is it real, this hidden place?" "Real as anything else in this cursed country," Joseph confirmed, then immediately looked like he regretted speaking so freely. "But that was long ago, before the wars ended and the old ways died. Probably nothing left now but wind and ghosts." He took another drink, using alcohol to blur the edges of memories that were obviously painful. But Cross had heard the uncertainty in the old Apache's voice, the kind of doubt that suggested half-remembered knowledge rather than certain ignorance. Somewhere in Joseph's whiskey-soaked brain were details about the hidden canyon that might be crucial to completing this contract successfully. "We'll search the area systematically tomorrow," Cross decided, settling back against his saddle. "If there's a hidden refuge out there, we'll find it, and when we do, we'll find Thomas Anderson's runaway wife." He didn't mention his growing suspicion that they might find considerably more than a frightened woman hiding in the desert. Nayati moved through the darkness like his namesake's spirit, every step calculated to avoid detection as he approached the bounty hunter's camp. Years of raiding and scouting had taught him to be invisible when necessary, and tonight, invisibility might mean the difference between a fair fight and a massacre. From his concealed position on a ridge overlooking their camp, he studied the two men with the cold assessment of someone evaluating enemies. The white bounty hunter was dangerous, no question about it. He slept lightly with his weapons close at hand, and even in rest, his body held the coiled tension of someone accustomed to violence. But it was Joseph who drew Nayati's closest attention. The old Apache sat by the dying fire, drinking steadily from a bottle that seemed to have no bottom. In the flickering light, his face showed the ravages of years spent drowning his conscience in alcohol, but also something else that gave Nayati hope. Joseph kept looking toward the hidden canyon, his expression troubled in a way that suggested internal conflict rather than simple intoxication. Nayati made his decision quickly, before caution could overrule the opportunity he saw before him. Moving with the silence that had made his reputation during the wars, he circled the camp until he was positioned behind Joseph's sitting place, close enough to speak without alerting the sleeping bounty hunter. "Hello, old friend," Nayati whispered in Apache, the familiar language cutting through Joseph's alcoholic haze like a blade through silk. The older man started violently, but had enough presence of mind not to cry out, recognizing the voice, even if he couldn't immediately identify its owner. "I know that voice," Joseph slurred, peering into the darkness with eyes that struggled to focus. "But it can't be. He died in the wars. Everyone said so." The confusion in his voice was painful to hear, evidence of how thoroughly whiskey had damaged his once sharp mind. "Not dead, Joseph. Just living quietly, away from the madness that consumed our people," Nayati replied, shifting slightly so the old man could see his face in the firelight. "The question is, what are you doing here, guiding white men to sacred places in exchange for bottle money?" Joseph's face crumpled with shame. And for a moment, he looked like the proud warrior he'd once been, instead of the broken drunk he'd become. "They offered gold," he whispered miserably. "More gold than I've seen in years, enough to buy whiskey for months." He gestured helplessly toward the sleeping bounty hunter. "I thought it was just another runaway wife, another woman who'd forgotten her place." "And now?" Nayati asked gently, recognizing the internal struggle playing out behind Joseph's bloodshot eyes. "Now I think maybe she had good reason to run," Joseph admitted, his voice thick with an emotion that might have been regret. "That white man, Cross, he talks about her like she's livestock that wandered off. And the money her husband's offering, it's too much for just bringing back a wife. Men don't pay that kind of gold unless they're planning something terrible." Learned to the show. Admission gave Nayati hope that enough of the old Joseph remained to be reasoned with. But time was short, and the bounty hunter might wake at any moment. "Help me protect her," Nayati said urgently. "Help me be the warrior you used to be, before the whiskey stole your honor. One last chance to stand on the right side of something that matters." He leaned closer, speaking with all the conviction he could muster. "Your ancestors are watching, Joseph. What will you tell them when you join them in the spirit world?" Joseph stared into the fire for a long moment, wrestling with demons that had nothing to do with alcohol and everything to do with the choices that had brought him to this desolate place. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a clarity that had been absent for years. "What do you need me to do?" Dawn broke with the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls, but they came from the wrong direction entirely. Instead of the careful advance Nayati had expected from the hidden entrance, Cross and his remaining men were riding boldly down the main trail, their weapons drawn but not immediately threatening. Joseph rode beside the bounty hunter, but something in his posture told Nayati that their midnight conversation had borne unexpected fruit. "Eleanor Anderson." Cross's voice boomed across the canyon, confident and commanding. "I know you're in there, and I know you can hear me. I've got a legal warrant for your return to your husband, signed by Territorial Judge Morrison himself. Come out peaceful-like, and nobody needs to get hurt." His tone suggested he was accustomed to having his demands met without argument. Eleanor appeared beside Nayati on the canyon's defensive ledge, her face pale but determined. She'd braided her hair back severely and armed herself with both rifle and pistol, transforming from frightened refugee to frontier woman prepared to fight for her freedom. "He's lying about the warrant," she said quietly. "Judge Morrison died last spring, and Thomas doesn't have that kind of legal authority anyway." "I figured as much," Nayati replied, studying the scene below with tactical eyes. Something was wrong with the approach, too direct and open for a man of Cross's obvious experience. Either the bounty hunter was supremely confident, or this was some kind of elaborate trap. Cross continued his performance, gesturing broadly toward the canyon walls. "I've got men positioned at every exit from this place. You can't run anymore, Mrs. Anderson. Your husband's worried sick about you, afraid you might hurt yourself in one of your fits. He just wants you to come home safe where you belong." The lies rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, but his eyes were constantly moving, cataloguing defensive positions and potential threats. "Your answer, Cross." Nayati called down, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "The woman stays here of her own free will. You've got no authority in Apache territory, warrant or no warrant." He deliberately used his full Apache pronunciation, letting the words carry the weight of ancestral claim and territorial right. Cross's expression darkened as he located Nayati's position on the ledge above. "So that's how it is. The famous ghost warrior of the desert canyons, protecting another man's wife. Thomas Anderson warned me you might be involved, breed. Said you had a reputation for stealing what belongs to civilized folks." The racial slur was delivered with calculated malice, designed to provoke a rash response. What happened next surprised everyone. Most of all, Joseph Crow Feather himself. The old Apache scout suddenly wheeled his horse around and drove his rifle butt into Cross's shoulder, sending the bounty hunter tumbling from his saddle. Before Cross could recover, Joseph had his own weapon trained on the man who'd been paying him. "I quit," Joseph announced in a voice that carried none of his usual drunken slur. "Find your own way to hell, Cross. I'm done guiding white men to places they got no business being." His transformation was remarkable. The broken drunk of the night before had been replaced by something resembling the warrior he'd once been. Cross rolled to his feet, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You drunken fool! I'm offering you more gold than you've seen in your entire miserable life, all for one crazy woman who doesn't have sense enough to appreciate a good husband." He reached for his pistol, but Joseph's rifle never wavered. "I said I quit," Joseph repeated, and this time his voice carried the kind of finality that wise men didn't argue with. "Right away, Cross. Take your men and your dirty money and find some other fool to lead you around the desert, but you don't get the woman and you don't get to desecrate this sacred place." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, two armed men facing each other, while Eleanor and Nayati watched from above. Cross was clearly calculating his chances, weighing the gold Thomas Anderson had promised against the very real possibility of dying in this god-forsaken canyon. His greed warred visibly with his survival instincts. "This isn't over," Cross snarled finally, holstering his weapon but keeping his hand near the grip. "Anderson's got resources you can't imagine, Breed. He'll send the army if he has to, claim you're harboring stolen property. How long do you think your little hideout will last against federal cavalry?" Nayati rose to his full height on the ledge, his figure silhouetted against the morning sky like something out of ancient legend. When he spoke, his voice carried across the canyon with the authority of someone who'd never backed down from a fight in his life. "Tell Thomas Anderson this, Cross. Tell him exactly these words so there's no misunderstanding between us." He paused, letting the silence build until every ear in the canyon was straining to hear his pronouncement. His wife chose freedom over his version of love. "She's under my protection now, and that protection comes with Apache steel and Apache honor." Behind it, Eleanor felt her breath catch as Nayati's hand moved to the knife at his belt, drawing the blade with fluid grace until sunlight ran like water along its polished edge. The weapon was beautiful and deadly, its handle carved with symbols she couldn't read but somehow understood, spoke of oaths that couldn't be broken. "One more mark on her," Nayati continued, his voice dropping to a register that seemed to vibrate in the canyon walls themselves. "One more bruise, one more threat, one more attempt to drag her back to a life she rejected, and I'll bury Thomas Anderson where he stands. His money won't protect him. His political connections won't save him. The only thing between him and an unmarked grave will be his willingness to let her go." The promise hung in the air like smoke from a ceremonial fire, carrying weight that went beyond mere words. Cross felt it, Eleanor felt it, even Joseph Crow Feather straightened in his saddle, as if recognizing something he'd thought lost forever. This wasn't just a threat from one man to another. It was a covenant sealed in front of witnesses, the kind of blood oath that Apache warriors had honored for generations. Cross's face had gone pale during Nayati's pronouncement, and when he spoke again, his voice carried none of its earlier confidence. "You're signing your own death warrant, Breed. Anderson's got friends in Washington, connections that reach all the way to the territorial governor. Cross the wrong man, and you'll find yourself hunted by more than just bounty hunters." "Let him come," Nayati replied with deadly calm. "Let him bring his friends, his connections, his territorial governor. This canyon has sheltered my people through wars with Mexico and wars with America. It'll shelter us through whatever Thomas Anderson thinks he can bring against it." He slid the knife back into its sheath with deliberate ceremony. But if he's smart, truly smart, he'll cut his losses and find himself a wife who wants to be owned. Eleanor stepped forward on the ledge, making herself visible to the men below. Her voice when she spoke was steady and clear, carrying the authority of someone who'd finally remembered her own worth. Mr. Cross, you can tell my former husband that Eleanor Anderson died in the desert 3 months ago. The woman who lives here now is someone else entirely, someone who won't be dragged back to a life of fear and brutality. She lifted her chin defiantly, and even from a distance Cross could see the steel that had replaced the frightened rabbit. Thomas Anderson had described, "I found my place, Mr. Cross. I found my purpose and my peace, and I found a man who values my mind as much as my obedience." Tell Thomas that his money can't buy back what he threw away when he decided love meant ownership. Her words carried across the canyon like a funeral oration for the woman she'd been forced to be. Joseph Crowfeather suddenly laughed. Sound like desert wind through dry grass. Did you hear that, Cross? The woman's got more backbone than you do. Maybe it's time to admit you've met your match and ride out while you still can. His rifle hadn't moved from its position, covering the bounty hunter. Cross's face cycled through rage, calculation, and finally a grudging kind of respect. He'd hunted enough runaway wives to recognize the difference between temporary rebellion and permanent transformation. Eleanor Anderson had clearly become someone else entirely, and that someone wasn't going to be dragged back to Santa Fe without a war that might cost more than Thomas Anderson was willing to pay. "This is a mistake," Cross said finally, swinging back into his saddle with movements sharp with suppressed anger. "Both of you are making enemies you can't afford to have. Anderson's not the kind of man who accepts defeat gracefully." But even as he spoke the warning, he was already turning his horse toward the canyon entrance. "Neither am I," Nayati replied quietly, the words carrying easily in the desert air. "Tell him to remember that when he's deciding what comes next." He watched the bounty hunter ride away, noting how Cross kept looking back over his shoulder as if memorizing the canyon's layout for future reference. Joseph remained behind. For a moment, looking up at the ledge where Nayati and Eleanor stood side by side. "I don't suppose there's room in that canyon for an old fool who's trying to remember how to be a man again," he called up, his voice carrying a humility that would have been impossible the day before. "There's always room for someone willing to stand on the right side of things," Nayati replied, genuine warmth entering his voice for the first time that morning. "Come up, old friend. We'll find you some coffee that doesn't come from a bottle." As Joseph dismounted and began making his way up the canyon trail, Eleanor turned to Nayati with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. "Did you mean it?" she asked quietly. "What? You said about protecting me, about burying Thomas if he tries to hurt me again." Nayati looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the frightened woman who'd collapsed in the desert months ago, but the strong, determined person she'd become, in the safety of the hidden canyon. "Every word," he said simply. "You're not alone anymore, Eleanor. You'll never have to face Thomas Anderson or anyone like him without someone standing beside you." She reached for his hand then, their fingers intertwining with the naturalness of two people who'd found something worth protecting in each other. Below them, the canyon spread out in morning light, beautiful and secure, and theirs to defend against whatever threats might come. "Then let him come," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the same steel that had rung in Nayati's promise. "Let Thomas Anderson bring his money and his connections and his rage. He'll find out that some things can't be bought and some people can't be broken twice." The sound of Cross's hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving the canyon in peaceful silence. But all three of the people standing in the hidden refuge knew that this was only the beginning. Thomas Anderson wouldn't accept defeat easily, and the next confrontation would test everything they'd built together. The first week after Cross's Departure. Joseph Crowfeather shook like a man with fever, his body rebelling against the absence of whiskey that had been his constant companion for years. Nayati and Eleanor took turns sitting with him through the worst of it, holding him down when the tremors became violent, feeding him broth when his stomach couldn't handle solid food, listening to him mutter in 3 different languages about ghosts and guilt and battles that should have been forgotten decades ago. "I killed children," Joseph confessed during one particularly dark night, his voice raw from hours of retching. During the Skeleton Canyon raids, there were Mexican children hiding in a root cellar. The soldiers said they were old enough to carry tales back to the army, old enough to identify Apache faces. I followed orders like a good scout, like a man, who'd forgotten his own people's laws about protecting the innocent. His weathered hands covered his face as if he could hide from memories that had been eating him alive for years. Eleanor sat beside his bedroll, offering water from a clay cup with the patience of someone who understood that healing sometimes required witnessing pain. "You were caught between impossible choices," she said gently. "War makes monsters of good men, and it sounds like you've been punishing yourself ever since." Her voice carried the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd learned to distinguish between guilt and responsibility. "Punishment doesn't bring back the dead," Nayati observed from his position by the fire, where he was brewing one of his grandmother's teas designed to ease the body's craving for alcohol. "But choosing to do better going forward honors their memory more than drinking yourself to death in a canyon somewhere." He brought the steaming cup to Joseph, helping the older man's shaking hands hold it steady. As the days passed, Joseph's body began to remember what sobriety felt like, but his mind struggled with the clarity that came without whiskey's numbing embrace. He threw himself into physical labor with desperate intensity, rebuilding sections of the canyon's defenses, tending the horses with obsessive care, hunting game with skills that gradually returned as his hands steadied and his eyes cleared. "I remember you now," Joseph said to Nayati one afternoon, as they worked together to expand the canyon's grain storage. "You were the one they called Shadow Walker, the scout who could disappear into country that looked flat as a table. The Mexican army put a bounty on your head after you led that rescue at Copper Canyon." His voice carried a mixture of respect and wonder, as if he couldn't believe he was working beside a legend. "That was a long time ago," Nayati replied, uncomfortable with the reverence in the older man's tone. "Different man, different war. What matters now is who we choose to be today." But Eleanor caught the way his shoulders straightened slightly at the recognition, the quiet pride of someone whose courage had been remembered even by broken men, seeking to forget their own. With Cross's departure, Eleanor had expected to feel relief, but instead she found herself dealing with emotions she'd suppressed for months. The constant vigilance required for survival was no longer necessary, leaving space for anger and grief she'd had no time to process while running for her life. The rage, when it finally came, surprised her with its intensity. "I lost 8 years of my life to that man," she told Nayati one evening as they walked the canyon's upper trails. 8 years of pretending to be someone else, of making myself smaller and quieter and more agreeable until I almost forgot who I used to be. And for what? So he could feel powerful, so he could tell his friends he'd tamed a willful woman. Her voice shook with fury that had been building since her wedding day. "Those years weren't lost," Nayati said carefully, recognizing the dangerous ground they were navigating. "They were stolen, which is different. Lost things disappear forever, but stolen things can sometimes be recovered. You're recovering yourself now, piece by piece, memory by memory." He gestured toward the teaching materials she'd been organizing, the medical supplies she'd catalogued, the improvements she'd suggested for the canyon's defenses. Eleanor paused in her pacing, struck by the distinction he'd drawn. "You really believe that? That I can get back who I was before Thomas destroyed her?" The question held a fragility that made Nayati choose his words with exceptional care. "I believe you're becoming someone new," he replied thoughtfully. "Someone who has the teacher's mind you were born with, the healer's hands you've developed here, and the survivor's strength you discovered in the desert. Thomas Anderson never met this version of you, which means he has no power over her." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. The woman who stood on that ledge and told Cross she'd found her place, that woman was magnificent, and she was entirely your own creation. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of bonds she'd carried so long they'd felt like part of her skeleton. For the first time since her escape, she began to think about a future that extended beyond mere survival, a life that might include purpose and joy and the kind of partnership she'd only read about in books. As autumn settled over the canyon, the three residents fell into routines that felt less like temporary arrangements and more like the foundation of something permanent. Joseph proved to have a gift for working with horses, his gentle touch and infinite patience creating a bond with the animals that amazed both Eleanor and Nayati. The paint stallion, Sehutsui, who'd never allowed anyone but Nayati near him, began accepting grain from Joseph's hands. "Horses know when a man's spirit is broken," Joseph explained, as he worked with a young mare they'd acquired from a passing trader. "They can smell the whiskey sickness, the self-hatred, all the poison that makes a person dangerous to be around, but they also know when someone's trying to heal, when the poison's being replaced with something better." His hands moved over the mare's neck with the same reverence his ancestors had shown for sacred objects. Eleanor found herself documenting not just Nayati's medical knowledge, but Joseph's understanding of animal behavior, creating what amounted to a comprehensive guide to desert survival and husbandry. The work gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her teaching days, the satisfaction of preserving knowledge that might help others survive similar hardships. "You're building a library," Nayati observed one evening, watching Eleanor organize her growing collection of handwritten manuals. "Future generations of refugees and outcasts will have roadmaps for survival because you took the time to write down what we've learned." The pride in his voice made Eleanor's cheeks warm with pleasure she'd almost forgotten how to feel. "We're all building something," Eleanor corrected, gesturing toward Joseph's carefully maintained horse corral and Nayati's expanded workshop. "A life, a home, a place where people who don't fit anywhere else can find their footing." She paused, struck by the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. "Thomas wanted to make me smaller, but instead, he drove me to a place where I could become larger than I ever imagined." The rider appeared at the canyon entrance on a Tuesday morning in late October, leading a pack horse and moving with the careful exhaustion of someone who'd been traveling hard for days. Eleanor's first instinct was panic, the old fear that Thomas had sent another hunter to drag her back to Santa Fe. But this rider was clearly a woman, and she approached with the deliberate openness of someone seeking help rather than offering a threat. "Hello, the canyon," the woman called out, using the traditional frontier greeting that announced peaceful intentions. "I'm looking for the healer they call Shadow Walker, and the teacher woman who helps people disappear from their old lives." Her voice carried a desperation that Eleanor recognized immediately. The woman was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of beauty that would have been celebrated in drawing rooms, but was now marred by fresh bruises and the hollow-eyed look of someone running on will alone. She clutched a bundle that Eleanor realized was a small child, maybe 3 years old, who watched the world with the unnaturally quiet attention of someone who'd learned that making noise brought pain. "My name is Carmen Delgado," the woman said as Nayati helped her down from her horse. "My husband is Lieutenant Miguel Delgado of the Territorial Militia. He's been using his position to cover up what he does to me and my daughter at home. When I finally tried to leave him, he had me declared mentally unfit and threatened to have Isabella taken away permanently." Her Spanish accent colored her English, with musical cadences that couldn't disguise the steel in her voice. Eleanor felt her heart clench with recognition and sympathy. Here was another woman who discovered that marriage could be a trap disguised as security, another mother willing to risk everything to protect her child from a man who confused love with ownership. "You're safe here," Eleanor said immediately, taking the little girl from Carmen's arms and noting how the child didn't resist the transfer. "Both of you are safe. No one will take Isabella away, and no one will force you to go back to a man who hurts you." The promise came easily, backed by everything they'd learned about defending their sanctuary. Carmen's arrival marked a turning point in the canyon's evolution from hideout to genuine community. Her skills as a seamstress and her knowledge of Spanish-language networks throughout the territory made her an invaluable addition to their small group. More importantly, her presence proved that what they'd built here could serve purposes larger than their individual needs. "There are others," Carmen told them as they shared dinner around the communal fire. "Other women trapped by husbands who use law and custom to justify cruelty. Other children who flinch when men raise their voices, who've learned to make themselves invisible to avoid attracting attention. They need places like this, sanctuaries, where they can remember who they used to be before fear became their constant companion." Joseph, who'd been quietly teaching little Isabella how to braid grass into ropes, looked up with something approaching his old warrior's intensity. "Then we make this place ready for them," he said simply. "We expand the defenses, increase the food stores, create space for families instead of just individuals. We become what we needed when we were broken." Eleanor felt a vision crystallizing in her mind, a picture of the canyon as it could become with proper planning and dedication. Not just a hiding place, but a genuine community where people could heal and grow and rediscover their own worth. The teacher in her recognized the educational possibilities, while the survivor in her understood the defensive necessities. "It won't be easy," Nayati warned, though his tone suggested he was already committed to the idea. More people means more complexity, more chances for discovery, more resources needed for survival. And every person we help becomes someone else's enemy, another reason for men like your husbands to want us destroyed. "Let them come," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the same steel that had rung in Nayati's promise to cross. "Let them bring their warrants and their weapons and their righteous anger about property that dared to walk away. They'll find out that some things grow stronger when they're tested." As winter settled over the hidden canyon, the 4 adults and 1 child worked together to prepare for whatever challenges the future might bring. They were no longer just individual survivors, but the founding members of something unprecedented in the harsh frontier landscape. A place where healing was possible, where strength could be rediscovered, and where the broken could learn to be whole again. Spring brought Thomas Anderson to the canyon, but not in the way anyone expected. He arrived alone on foot, carrying a white flag made from a torn shirt, and moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculations. 3 days of hard riding followed by a night spent lost in the desert had stripped away his usual arrogance, leaving behind someone who looked almost human for the first time in years. Nayati spotted him first from the watchpost, recognizing the expensive cut of clothes now torn and dusty from hard travel. "He's alone," Nayati called down to where Eleanor was teaching Carmen's daughter to read. "No weapons visible, carrying what looks like a surrender flag." The observation carried surprise that such a man would approach without the protection of hired guns or legal authority. None. Eleanor felt her stomach clench with familiar fear, but when she looked around the canyon at the life she'd built here, the emotion transformed into something harder and more useful. She'd faced Thomas Anderson as a frightened victim once before, but that woman no longer existed. In her place stood someone who'd survived the desert, learned to shoot straight, and helped create a sanctuary that had already saved 3 lives. "Let him come up," Eleanor decided, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "But Joseph stays with the horses, and you keep your rifle ready. I want to hear what Thomas Anderson has to say when he doesn't have the advantage." She gathered Carmen and little Isabella, moving them to the most protected part of the canyon while keeping her own weapons within easy reach. Thomas Anderson climbed the canyon trail like a man walking to his own execution, each step measured and careful. When he finally reached the main camp, Eleanor was shocked by the change in him. The confident rancher who'd terrorized her for 8 years had been replaced by someone hollow-eyed and desperate, aged beyond his years by whatever had driven him to make this journey. "Eleanor," he said simply, his voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "I need to talk to you. Just talk, nothing more. I know I don't deserve even that, but I'm asking anyway." His hands remained visible and empty, the white flag draped over his shoulder like a badge of surrender. "Talk then," Eleanor replied, standing beside Nayati with the canyon walls rising protectively around them. "But understand that I'm not the woman you married, Thomas. That person died in the desert the day I chose freedom over your version of love." Her voice carried none of the subservience he'd once demanded, none of the fear he'd cultivated so carefully over 8 years of marriage. Thomas nodded slowly, as if he'd expected nothing else. "Cross told me what you said about Eleanor Anderson being dead. He also told me about the Apache who swore to kill me if I put another mark on you." His eyes found Nayati, studying the man who'd become his wife's protector. "I came here to say I believe him, about the killing, I mean, and to say that maybe Eleanor Anderson needed to die." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying implications that none of them had expected to hear from Thomas Anderson's lips. Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, not forgiveness exactly, but a loosening of the grip that hatred had held on her heart. "What happened, Thomas?" she asked quietly, genuinely curious about what could have changed a man so fundamentally. "What made you ride out here alone, without your hired guns or your legal papers or your righteous anger about stolen property?" Thomas sat down heavily, on a nearby rock, suddenly looking older than his 43 years. "I married again," he said simply. 6 weeks after I declared you legally dead. A young woman from Denver, barely 20, with that same spark of independence that attracted me to you in the first place." He laughed bitterly, the sound carrying no humor whatsoever. "And you tried to break her the same way you broke me," Eleanor observed, understanding flooding through her with terrible clarity. "You tried to make her smaller and quieter and more agreeable until she learned to flinch when you raised your voice." "I succeeded," Thomas said quietly, his voice thick with self-loathing. "Margaret Anderson is everything you refuse to become. Obedient, silent, grateful for the smallest kindness. She thanks me for not hitting her, Eleanor. She's grateful when I merely shout instead of using my fists." He buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with something that might have been grief. "But breaking her didn't fix what was wrong with me," Thomas continued, his voice muffled by his hands. "It just showed me what I'd become, what I'd been doing to you for 8 years, without ever seeing it clearly. Margaret looks at me the same way you used to look at me toward the end, like I was something dangerous that might strike without warning." Nayati had remained silent throughout the confession, but now he spoke with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen too much violence to be impressed by displays of remorse. "Regret doesn't undo harm," he said simply. "Understanding your cruelty doesn't heal the people you broke with it." "I know that," Thomas replied, looking up to meet Nayati's gaze directly. "I'm not here asking for forgiveness or trying to make amends that can't be made. I'm here because I finally understand what Cross meant when he said Eleanor Anderson was magnificent. She was, and I spent 8 years trying to destroy that magnificence because it threatened my need to feel powerful. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unexpected gift of being seen clearly by someone who'd spent years refusing to acknowledge her humanity. Then why are you here, Thomas? What do you want from me? Thomas reached into his coat slowly, producing a thick envelope that he held out toward Eleanor with hands that trembled slightly. Divorce papers, he said simply. Legal and binding. Filed with the territorial court in Santa Fe. You're free, Eleanor, officially and completely free to be whoever you choose to be. He set the envelope on the ground between them, unwilling to approach close enough to hand it over directly. There's also a deed to a section of land north of Albuquerque, good water rights and mineral claims included. Consider it payment for 8 years of your life that I stole, though I know it's not nearly enough compensation for what you endured. He stood slowly, suddenly looking ancient, despite his relatively young age. Eleanor picked up the envelope, with hands that barely shook, scanning the legal documents with the careful attention of someone who'd learned never to trust gifts from dangerous men. But the papers appeared genuine, signed and sealed with official territorial stamps that would be difficult to forge. Why? She asked finally, looking up at the man who'd once controlled every aspect of her existence. Why give me this freedom, instead of fighting to drag me back? You spent months hiring bounty hunters and making threats. What changed? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the canyon walls that rose around them like natural cathedral spires. I realized that everything I thought I wanted was just fear, disguised as love, he said finally. I was afraid of being alone, afraid of not being important enough to keep a woman's attention, afraid that if I didn't control you completely, you'd see who I really was and leave. The irony is that my fear of abandonment guaranteed the very abandonment I was trying to prevent. Carmen emerged from the protected alcove, where she'd been waiting with Isabella, approaching with the caution of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of men bearing gifts. "What about your new wife?" she asked in accented English. "Will you try to break her spirit completely, now that you've acknowledged what you did to Eleanor?" The question hit Thomas like a physical blow, and Eleanor saw him flinch, as if Carmen had struck him. "I don't know," he admitted with painful honesty. "I'd like to say I'll be different, that understanding my cruelty will make me capable of kindness. But I've been this way for so long I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else." "Then learn," Nayati said firmly, speaking with the authority of someone who'd successfully rebuilt his own character from the ground up. "Find people who can teach you to be better than you've been. Pay for Margaret to have her own resources, her own education, her own choices. Give her the same freedom you're giving Eleanor." Thomas Anderson left the canyon as quietly as he'd arrived, but not before witnessing something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As evening fell and the community gathered around, their communal fire, he saw Eleanor laugh with genuine joy at something Joseph had said. The sound was like music, bright and free, and utterly without the careful calculation that had marked every interaction during their marriage. She was always capable of that happiness, Nayati told him quietly as they watched Eleanor help Carmen braid Isabella's hair. "You just never gave her reason to share it with you." The words weren't cruel, just observational, but they cut deeper than any insult could have. "I know," Thomas replied, shouldering his pack for the long journey back to Santa Fe. "I spent 8 years married to an extraordinary woman, and I was too afraid and selfish to let her be extraordinary. That's a failure I'll have to live with for the rest of my life." He paused at the canyon entrance, looking back one last time at the sanctuary his wife had found without him. "Take care of her," he said to Nayati, the words carrying the weight of genuine benediction. She deserves to be protected by someone strong enough not to need to break her, to feel powerful. Then he disappeared into the desert darkness, leaving behind a silence that felt more like peace than victory. 6 months later, the hidden canyon had grown into something resembling a small town, with carefully constructed dwellings that took advantage of natural caves and overhangs. Word had spread through networks of abused women and runaway families, bringing a steady trickle of refugees seeking the kind of sanctuary that existed nowhere else in the harsh frontier territories. Eleanor had established a school that served both the resident children and those passing through on their way to new lives. Her reputation as a teacher who could help people reinvent themselves had spread far beyond the canyon walls, bringing her a sense of purpose that marriage had never provided. Carmen's sewing skills had evolved into a thriving business that provided income for the entire community, her connections to Spanish-speaking networks throughout the Southwest, making her an invaluable coordinator for their expanding rescue operations. Joseph had become the canyon's primary defender and scout, his knowledge of the country and his renewed sense of honor making him the perfect guardian for people who needed protection from their pasts. The whiskey was gone for good, replaced by a clarity of purpose that had given him back his warrior's pride. And Nayati had found something he'd never expected to have. A family not bound by blood, but by choice. A community that honored his mixed heritage rather than punishing him for it, and a partnership with Eleanor that was built on respect rather than need. On quiet evenings, when the canyon was peaceful and the future seemed full of possibility, Eleanor would sit beside Nayati on the ledge where she'd first declared her independence from Thomas Anderson. The desert stretched out before them in all directions, no longer a barrier to escape, but a protective moat around the life they'd built together. "Do you ever regret it?" Nayati asked one such evening, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the sun set over their chosen home. "Giving up the safety of civilization for the uncertainty of this life?" Eleanor leaned into his warmth, thinking of all the people who'd found refuge in their canyon, all the children who'd learned to laugh again within these protective walls. "I regret wasting 8 years being afraid," she said finally. "But I don't regret anything that brought me here, to this place, with these people, with you. Sometimes the best things in life come disguised as disasters." The Apache warrior, who'd drawn his blade in defense of a stranger, had become something more than either protector or lover. He'd become partner to a woman who'd learned to protect herself. And together, they'd built something that would outlast them both. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.